Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Youth Will Be Swerved by Robert M. Lee. Detective Story Magazine, January 6, 1920. Old Ezra Saunders, the Marshal of Turtle Hill, sat sunning himself on the edge of the board stoop in front of the City Hotel. A battered hat was tilted down over his squinting eyes, and his toothless gums worried away at a quid of fine cut. Now and again, he scratched luxuriously at a skinny shin with the toe of a decrepit shoe. As old Ezra's narrow glance skimmed along the 2 rows of unpainted wooden buildings that adorned the single thoroughfare of the city, he spied, stepping forth from the most pretentious of these structures, Mr. Truman Nesbitt, owner thereof. But for a couple of farmers' teams hitched in the street, the only signs of animation in the entire municipality were exhibited by Ezra and Mr. Nesbitt. Old Ezra squinted and chewed. Mr. Nesbitt approached the withered marshal with a dignity and purpose that well became a man of his importance. Mr. Nesbitt kept a general store, dealt in mortgages, sold farm machinery, and kept his finger on the metropolitan pulse. He was a Republican. His right-hand man, Hickory Jones by name, was a Democrat. When the Republicans were in authority, Mr. Nesbitt was postmaster. When the Democrats were accorded the honor of administering national affairs, Hickory Jones was postmaster. Wherefore it will be seen that the postmastership potentially, vicariously, or actually, was in the hands of Mr. Nesbitt. He was a spare man, of medium height, with a face dried and expressionless. His lips were thin and cruel. His heart, if we are to suppose that he had one, beat only for Truman Nesbitt. As he bore down upon old Ezra, the eyes of the marshal narrowed a little, and his rabbit-like jaws worked more agitatedly. "Mornin', Truman," said Ezra. "Saunders," said Mr. Nesbitt, without bothering about returning the greeting. "There was a meeting of the trustees last night." Ezra's jaws actually suspended operations. Mr. Nesbitt's abruptness presaged something portentous. Mr. Nesbitt was president of the Board of Trustees. Hickory Jones was a member. 3 other members, citizens of Turtle Hill, were known to be in the power of Mr. Nesbitt by reason of certain incautious loans negotiated. "There was a meeting of the board," repeated the president, "and there was taken up the matter of cutting down the city budget. It is costing too much to run the city. It was decided that Turtle Hill don't need the services of a marshal. Crimes ain't frequent enough. In fact, there ain't any crimes." Old Ezra's heart skipped a beat or two. He gulped twice before he could find his voice. "Why, Truman," he said in his piping old notes, "you mean I ain't going to be marshal no longer?" "That's the sentiment of the board," said Mr. Nesbitt crisply. "You may turn over the appurtenances of your office on the 1st of next month. Your salary will continue until then." "Truman," said the old man, rising. "Truman, why, Mr. Nesbitt, I've been marshal here for a good many years, going on 20, I reckon. I ain't always given good service." "It isn't a question of service," said Nesbitt. "Anyone would do as well. You've just been making a living off the taxpayers. And besides, there's nothing to do. That's all I have to say." With these few genial remarks, Mr. Nesbitt faced about and marched back to his general store, where he devoted himself to the composition of a letter calculated to frighten a mortgagee out of a year's growth. Old Ezra stood dumbfounded, gazing listlessly down the street and out upon the open prairie where the main road turned. His nether lip quivered just the least bit, and his knotted hands twitched at his trouser seams. Then an inquisitive look came into his eyes as a strange vehicle entered his line of vision, turned the corner, and approached the business district of Turtle Hill with the speed of an express train. The next moment, a long, rakish, sporty racing model automobile drew up a half-block away, and a young man leaped out. Ezra's fascinated gaze was kept riveted on the car. He admired the steel disc wheels, the snappy long hood, the spare wheels slung to the rear, and above all, the bewildering blue in which the body was resplendent. The youth who had leaped from his seat walked briskly to old Ezra. The marshal sized him up briefly, a pair of shifty eyes, a weak chin, smart city clothes. Old Ezra sniffed suspiciously. "Uncle," said the sleek youth airily, "I wonder if you can tell me where I can find Mr. Truman Nesbit." Ezra continued his calm scrutiny. Then he said, "Where'd you get the idea I was your uncle?" "Oh, no offense," returned the youth a little sharply. "Can you give me the information?" "He runs the store you see right down the road there," said Ezra. "And be careful you don't get lost on the way." The young man turned away. A few steps from old Ezra, he threw up his arm and waved to another youth who still sat in the spanking racer. That one waved in return, threw in his gears and started off. In a few moments he was out of sight round the same turn in the road from which he had arrived. The one who remained, and who had so brusquely roused the ire of old Ezra, continued on his way to Nesbit's store. Once inside, he removed his cap. Hickory Jones, a pencil thrust over his ear, came round from behind the counter, where he was engaged in selling cotton worsted to a slipshod customer, and gave the newcomer a good morning. "I would like to see Mr. Nesbit," said the youth. "Right back at his desk," said Hickory. He indicated an ancient piece of furniture in the rear, half hidden behind piles of clothing, bolts of goods, and heaps of groceries. The young man followed Hickory's dirty finger, and soon found himself in the presence of the town Croesus. "Pardon me," he said haltingly. "I have a letter for you." "Eh?" said Nesbit. "Letter?" "Yes, sir, a letter of introduction." "Let's see it," said Nesbit, snatching it. He opened it and read, "Dear Nesbit, you may not recall the name of your boyhood playmate. Since those days of long ago, I may say in all modesty that I have risen in the world. I am now president of the Laborers' Bank of this city. This will introduce my nephew, Ralph Payne, whose health is not of the best. I want you to take him into your store where he can have the benefit of your instruction in business matters while at the same time benefiting by the change of scene and climate. Pay him little or no salary as you decide. I know you will do this for the sake of an old friendship. Yours sincerely, John Walker." Mr. Nesbit shrewdly read the letter word by word, and then went over it again to make sure. Presently a very tight smile played about his lips. "John Walker," said he. "John Walker. I don't seem to remember the name." "Uncle said he was afraid you wouldn't," explained young Payne. "He said it was a good many years ago. Names do slip out of a fellow's mind, you know." Mr. Nesbit continued to ponder. His natural sagacity in improving each shining minute and in developing every potential financial advantage bade him take a deep interest in the request of the president of the Laborers' Bank. While he couldn't place John Walker among his boyhood chums, he felt that he couldn't afford to offend a powerful money interest by insisting too strongly on what might be a mere lapse of memory. Even if he couldn't recall Walker, why shouldn't he place himself in the way of turning an honest penny? Honest penny indeed. Why not affairs of thousands and millions if he were associated with big bankers? Mr. Nesbit had always fancied himself a Wall Street magnate, and here might be the very opportunity to prove it. "Let me see," he said, tapping his head retrospectively. "John Walker. It seems to me the recollection comes to me now. Yes, I recall. It was a good many years ago. Dear old John. Young man, I am very glad to welcome you here." With more good nature than he had displayed in months, Mr. Nesbit arose and extended a hand that was about as warm and vigorous as a salt mackerel. "Of course," said Payne with a grin, expressing himself in language that, in more urban centers, might have been questioned for its correctness. "I ain't been out of college but a little while." "So, Whatever you put me at, I'll be glad to learn. Mr. Nesbit, expanding more and more as the possibilities of commercial enlargement occurred to him, clapped the young man on the back and, with a cackling laugh, assured him they would get along like two peas in a pod. Then he summoned Hickory Jones. "Jones," he said, "shake hands with Mr. Ralph Payne, nephew of my old school companion, John Walker, president of the Laborers' Bank of New York. He's going to stay with us a while, learn some business tricks and get his health back. We've got plenty of air, eh, Hickory?" Hickory brushed his hair out of his eyes with one red and somewhat soiled hand, while he wiped the other off on his trousers and presented it for a handshake. "Yes," he said, wondering if this new clerk meant the loss of his own job. "I guess we can find something for Mr. Payne to do." It was near noon. Mr. Nesbit insisted that his protégé walk home to lunch with him. As they emerged from the store, old Ezra, still standing on the board stoop of the City Hotel, gazed intently after Mr. Payne, who had thus suddenly thrust himself into the metropolitan turn of events. Then, remembering his own concerns, he rubbed the grey stubble of his chin and shambled off. "Danged automobile them fellas came in," he muttered. "Kinda makes my old squib look like a coffee grinder." The rakish racing car remained uppermost in his mind as he turned down past a long shed and entered a small wooden shanty in the rear. As he threw open the door, the sunlight flooded old Ezra's squib. It was one of the smallest and oldest automobiles in captivity. The hood had been rattled completely off, and the engine, a veritable toy in comparison to the giant 12s of modern manufacture, was exposed to the elements. Hard rubber tires had long since replaced pneumatic. Rattling steel braces remained to tell of what once had been polished and bravely important fenders. Old Ezra patted the radiator cap fondly. "It's all right, old girl," he said. "You ain't so all-fired long on looks, but you go where you're pointed." He raised a battered seat cushion and extracted a handful of greasy tools. The next moment he was puttering away, turning a nut here, tapping a bolt there. It was old Ezra's greatest solace, tinkering with his beloved squib. A week passed during which old Ezra punctiliously performed the duties of marshal, plodded about, tinkered with his squib, and made the rounds of the stores in the evenings. His discharge from the service he had enjoyed so long weighed heavily upon him, but he made no sign. The news had been gossiped about the hamlet, and old Ezra knew he was the subject of much comment, acrid and otherwise. He was an old man to engage in new fields, but the law had spoken. One night he was shuffling around as usual. He spied a light in Nesbit's store. This was an unusual thing. Turtle Hill was going to bed, and this was no time for lights in the Nesbit store, old Ezra reflected. Turtle Hill's shingled roofs stood out in clear relief in the moonlight. An occasional night-prowling cat scampered in and out of the shadows. Old Ezra poked along the rickety sidewalk until he reached a place of observation at one of the dusty front windows of Nesbit's. His squinting eyes took in the interior of the establishment and then were fixed on a figure that was bent over a lamp behind the arrangement of pigeonholes which served as the Turtle Hill post office. The figure was that of Ralph Payne, the shifty, weak-chinned Ralph Payne, to whose presence in the city old Ezra could attribute no profitable reason. Had old Ezra known it, Payne had been spending each evening in the store. He had risen in the esteem of Mr. Nesbit with surprising alacrity. He had a felicitous way of anticipating Mr. Nesbit's every want, a trait conspicuously absent in Hickory Jones, and Mr. Nesbit observed with satisfaction that Payne was not averse to working overtime. Wherefore the young man had been provided with a key so that he might pore over the intricacies of bookkeeping. But to the intense scrutiny of old Ezra, it was apparent that Payne was not investigating the double-entry system. On the contrary, he was devoting himself to the secrets of the United States postal establishment with rapt attention. While the withered old marshal stood silently outside the store, Payne swiftly riffled a pack of letters which he had dumped out of the Daily Mail pouch, outgoing in the morning. Presently, he tossed aside a single letter and paused in his search. His lips curled in an evil smile. The letter was addressed to John Walker, President of the Laborers' Bank, New York. Without the slightest hesitation, Payne slit the envelope, extracted the letter, and read it with rising zest and appreciation. "Very proud to have you recall me," ran the small and cramped words of Nesbit. "Glad to have an opportunity of serving you. Mr. Payne is a delightful young man, sure to succeed in business." Payne read and threw back his head with a laugh. He continued to read, "And I am thinking of settling in New York. Perhaps you can give me a few pointers." A dry, wheezing cough in the immediate vicinity broke the silence. Old Ezra had repressed a villainous tickling in his throat until he was like to choke. Tears in his squinting eyes were mute evidence of his determination to prevent this most unsleuth-like outburst. But in spite of his efforts, a mighty expulsion of air from his creaky larynx punctuated the calm of the night. The letter dropped from Payne's hands. He glanced guiltily out into the street and saw old Ezra, his back turned, engaged in a perfect furore of sneezing and coughing. Payne quickly thrust the letter into his pocket, extinguished the oil lamp, and, affecting the utmost unconcern, came out onto the sidewalk, locked the door, and turned to old Ezra with an expression of mild astonishment. "Well, Uncle," said he breezily, "aren't you out pretty late?" Old Ezra mastered his sneezing. "You still seem to have the idea that I'm some kin to you, don't you?" he said. "Otherwise, I'll agree it is pretty late." With this, he glanced meaningfully at the Nesbit protégé. Mr. Payne caught the significance of the last observation and also the glance. "Jay, I was working late on the books," he said, wondering if by any chance old Ezra suspected him of intrigue. "You kind of like bookkeeping, I suppose?" queried the old man in a whimsical tone. "Say," burst out Payne, "you ain't trying to josh me, are you?" "Oh my no," said old Ezra. "No, I wouldn't do that. Well, I've got to go." He turned abruptly to skip along. The new clerk clenched his hands in anger. "I wonder if that old stiff meant anything," he muttered as he strode off. In the morning, he lost no time in fortifying himself in the good graces of his employer. "Funny experience last night," he said casually to Mr. Nesbit. "I was working late on the books when I happened to look up and see that comic Valentine town marshal peeking in at the window. Thought he was a burglar for a minute and it kind of scared me." "Oh, don't worry about him," said Nesbit reassuringly. "This is his last month. I found I had to discharge him. I'm president of the Board of Trustees, you know," he ventured with a pardonable glow of pride. "Old Ezra is out of date. I told him we didn't need a marshal, and he'd better get out. When he turns in the keys and his papers, we'll have a better marshal." "I was wondering," said Payne, carefully averting his employer's eyes, "if he mightn't come around and tell you some kind of story about me. You see, he might not know that I'm in the habit of putting in time nights." "Don't worry about that, my boy," said Nesbit patronizingly. "Ezra's apt to have a lot of foolish ideas, but they don't get far with me. He's considered a little cracked." Payne was highly elated and went off whistling about his duties. Nesbit again congratulated himself upon his good fortune in having such an industrious youth thrust in his way. Then he bethought himself of something and summoned Payne to him again. "Now that you are getting on so well," he said confidingly, "I feel that I can take you into some of the secrets of the business here. There is a little bit of extra work." Here the merchant smiled blandly. "Just a little extra work we do on the last Sunday of each month. You see, we have the post office report, the cash report, that is, to make out so the receipts can be sent to the United States repository for this district. We always make it a point to balance our cash for the store, you know, at the same time, killing two birds with one stone. So, if you don't mind, next Sunday we'll put in a little time here with the books. Payne's furtive eyes betokened no inconsiderable pleasure at the prospect of this extra work. He assured his employer that he would be delighted to have an opportunity to learn the details of the business under such a splendid instructor. In the lunch hour, he walked leisurely to the railroad station and filed a telegraph message. It was addressed to a person in a nearby city and said simply, "Can you come for a visit Saturday night? A friend of mine drives over now and then," he explained to the operator. "Nice to know someone with a car." The operator admitted that he would say it was, and forthwith became of the opinion that Mr. Payne was a very desirable addition to the town of Turtle Hill. On Saturday evening, when the dusk had fallen and the first lights of the village began to glimmer, old Ezra, content with having done as much tinkering as he could for that day, crawled out from under his dilapidated automobile and paused for a moment to ease the crick in his back. His little garage was somewhat back from the main street, wherefore he had a plain and unobstructed view of the environs of Turtle Hill. This fact, as he straightened up, made it possible for him to feel a slight thrill of interest as a pair of headlights came into view down the road. He dropped a wrench and an oil can and shaded his eyes with his hand as if the time were noon and a blazing sun were overhead. Then he closed the door to the garage and, remaining inside, kept an eye glued to a large and convenient knothole. The car came straight down the street and turned off on the side street in which stood old Ezra's garage. Ezra was able to see that the car carried only a driver. Presently this person was joined by another. This second man was Payne. Payne made a gesture in the direction of old Ezra's garage, and the driver of the automobile moved his machine slowly into position alongside. "This'll be all right," said Payne. "No chance of anybody stealing it, is there?" asked the driver. "Never in the world," said Payne. Then, as old Ezra listened, their voices trailed off in the distance. The old man emerged cautiously from his garage. When he had convinced himself that he was quite alone, he turned his attention to the car that had just arrived. The Freemasonry of automobilists has one surging emotion in common: investigation, inspection, and discussion of the other fellow's car. From this tendency, old Ezra was not immune. No sooner had he laid eyes on the machine than he emitted a low whistle of surprise. It was the very long, low-hung, blue-painted racer in which young Payne had arrived in Turtle Hill. He cogitated for a long while over this coincidence. Then a shrewd look came over his weather-beaten features. He trudged up the dirt street to the main thoroughfare. It rapidly was growing darker. One by one, the lights in the scattered stores were being extinguished, and the business fraternity of Turtle Hill was seeking just repose after a hard week. Old Ezra stood in the shadow of the blacksmith shop and waited patiently until the street was deserted. Two shadowy figures came along the street and paused before Nesbitt's store. They sat on the edge of the board sidewalk. A game of waiting ensued. The minutes and the half-hours dragged slowly along, but still old Ezra remained motionless in his shadowy niche, his squinting eyes peering through the murk toward Nesbitt's store. The men sitting there continued to talk in low tones. Interminably, it seemed to the patient old marshal. It was well after midnight when old Ezra saw them rise and gaze carefully in all directions. Then they turned to the door. A key was fitted into the lock, and both disappeared inside. Old Ezra turned back from his hiding place toward his garage. Then, as if the glory of the magnificent racing car was too alluring to be denied, he hesitated, seemed to swerve from his original purpose, and in the next moment was lost in contemplation of a machine which so far surpassed his own rattling squib as to make him sad indeed. He pressed a finger against one of the tires as if to test the resiliency thereof, and then extended his inspection to the seat, the spare wheel, and all the other delectable parts. Finally, as if the habit was strong upon him, he let himself down and inched his way under the car, where he might better view the mechanism. As if this were possible at such a time of night. A little later, he arose and investigated the rear of the machine, seemingly interested in the size and operation of the gasoline tank. Presently, his investigations were complete, and he stood back with a little wag of his head, which apparently betokened full approval. He bade farewell to his employment, and then made off across lots to his bachelor apartment over the hardware store. In his customary methodical way, he undressed, wound up his watch, and placed it under his pillow, wound his alarm clock, saw that everything was in place, then extinguished the light and retired. He was quiet only for a moment. He arose again, and taking the alarm clock into the starlight which illuminated the space about his window, he set its hand at 3:30. He returned to his couch. Thus, while old Ezra and all the rest of Turtle Hill slept, there was ample quiet for the enterprise which was going forward in Nesbit's store. Payne and his newly arrived companion locked the door behind them. The newcomer flashed a small pocket bulb. "Put it away, Pete," whispered Payne. "That old stiff of a marshal can see a light further than an owl. He nearly nailed me when I was picking out that letter to my fake Uncle John." "We can't work without a little light, can we?" asked the person called Pete. "Sure," said Payne. "This old safe will fall open like a pumpkin. But there ain't no hurry. I know where everything is. That's why I came down here and played Little Willie for this old money grabber. Take it easy. I know when everybody in the town gets up and what they do after they get up." Pete extracted a small kit from an inside pocket, and they both attacked the old-fashioned safe with an air of expert mechanics intent upon performing a very ordinary job of repair work. The fine steel of the tools bit into the door of the safe with the greatest ease. Fluid explosive was introduced into the crevices around the lock. A pile of gunny was brought and wrapped around the strong box in a leisurely fashion. Pete touched off the fuse. There was a chug of exploding gases, and the door of Nesbit's safe stood invitingly open. Payne swiftly ran his fingers along the pigeonholes inside and selected the contents. A cold chisel pried this open. Pete produced a strong canvas money bag and his pencil flashlight. They carefully took packages of bills and rolls of coin and dropped them into the bag, while at the same time they laid aside such things as checks and papers, which could not be negotiated without attendant danger. "What do you make it?" asked Pete hoarsely. "A little over 10,000, said Payne. "I didn't think it would go that strong, but I know the old man has been squeezing down on some mortgages. And the money orders were good this month. Well, let's get out of here." Swiftly and silently they unlocked the door, then locked it behind them. They trotted down the side street to the fancy racing automobile. A minute later, there was a rasp of the starter, a few detonations of the motor, and the machine purred softly down the main road and out of the precincts of Turtle Hill. Payne heaved a huge sigh. "I begin to feel human again," he said. "You know, that learning the business stuff was getting my goat. I couldn't have stood it another week." "Yeah, but it pays," said Pete. "It makes a good combination. You pick out the boobs and get all the information, and I come along and crack the box. That's better than this old-time yegg stuff." The splendid motor fairly ate up the road. Grey dawn was beginning to break. A farmer's dog barked far in the distance. "You know," said Pete, "I'll do better when we get off this main road. There ain't a crossroad for about 5 miles yet. Of course we'll get away all right, but it ain't the best place to be, running on the only road out of town." "Step on her," advised Payne. Pete did as he was bid. The motor responded nobly to the fresh rush of gasoline, and then sputtered helplessly. Energy suddenly was suspended, and the car sped along for 50 yards or more on momentum. Pete swiftly ran his mind over all the possibilities. He stepped on the gasoline lever, advanced the spark, tried the lights. The magnificent machine slowly came to a stop. "What the—" Payne started expostulating. Pete stopped him with a gesture. "This ain't no time to cuss," said he. "Let's see what's the matter." Both sprang out. Pete's swift survey of the locality told him they were in a very lonesome section, far from any farmhouse where questions might be aroused. They were 10 miles from Turtle Hill and several miles from the first crossing. Pete jerked up the hood. The motor stood there as imposing and competent as ever. He jumped back into the seat and tried the starter. It worked, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "Gasoline?" asked Payne. "Plenty," said Pete. "Filled the tank before I came over." "Oil?" "Chuck full too. I attended to that before I came, you bet." Pete sprang out again and seized a handful of wrenches with which he dove under the car and began a search for the trouble. Payne, nervous and angry, stomped back and forth. "If this ain't sputtered," he grumbled. Everything was going swell until just now, and this beautiful big bum of a dustpan has to break a leg. Nearly half an hour passed. Things were pressing. Pete, too, was growing nervous. Time was precious. Then both men stood stock still. The sputtering of a motor came to them from the distance. A moment later, a rickety, clattering and ancient flivver came into view. Both the safe blowers breathed deeply. "I thought we were in for it," said Pete. "But I guess they don't come chasing yeggs in those things." Relieved of their worries, they turned again to the task of repairing their car. The noisy little machine came closer. The half-dusk prevented a full view of the driver, who drew up and stopped with a chug. "Stick up your hands, gentlemen," said a cracked, unmusical, quavering old voice. Payne and Pete whirled around. They were looking into the barrel of a huge automatic. Over the top of it squinted the cool eye of old Ezra Saunders. "Well, I'll be," began Payne. "I wouldn't utter no profanity, young man," said the marshal. "It ain't fitting. So now if you boys'll just behave nice, I'll take you back without no trouble." Pete's mind worked rapidly. "Our car's broke down," said he. "We'll have to ride with you." "Wouldn't that be handy?" said old Ezra. "And me driving, and you throwing me out in the ditch." "Like as not. Now then," he continued sharply, "just you boys take hold of that machine and turn her face about. She's a little heavy, but so is this here gun of mine." Bewildered at the turn of events, Pete and Payne laid hold with a will, and with many stops and starts and forwards and backings. They managed to turn the racer right about. "Now," said Ezra, "take off your coats and lay 'em in my car one at a time. Gimme them too. Now get into your car and sit there, real peaceful." The safe blowers did as they were requested. Old Ezra, expert in the use of the squib he had driven so long, maneuvered with amazing deftness so that he turned around and brought up in the rear of the racer. "One more request, gentlemen," he said. "Just hand over the money over the back of the car. Thanks. Now then, one of you take hold of your steering wheel, and I'll do the rest." The sputtering flivver thrust its nose into the rear of its magnificent captive and pushed. The extraordinary pageant began its return journey, with old Ezra driving with one hand and holding his pistol on the captives before him. In the meantime, early rising Turtle Hill was in a furore. Hickory Jones had made the discovery. Having repaired to the store for his breakfast butter, he found the broken safe. He aroused Nesbit, who promptly flew into dismay. "Where's old Ezra Saunders?" he demanded. "Gone, eh? Well, I'm glad I fired him. When he's needed, he's never around. So it was Payne, eh? I knew he was playing a game on me. I never remembered any John Walker until he came with that smooth story. I suspected him all along. Hickory, you should have watched that scamp." Inside of a half hour, the whole of Turtle Hill's citizenry was gathered about the looted store. All offered advice, but none went after the robbers. "It's no use," put in the telegraph operator. "He's gone with the fella with that racing car. He telegraphed for him to come over here." "Why didn't you tell me?" demanded Nesbit. "How would I know what he was meditating?" moaned the operator. "I thought he was just lonesome." Someone pointed a finger down the road. "What's that?" asked a dozen voices. Then all the townsfolk gathered along the thoroughfare in the manner of multitudes greeting a conquering hero. And it was a fitting welcome, for with a slow and stately motion as of a conqueror's chariot came the rattling flivver of old Ezra, pushing the gaudy racer. In the latter sat the two spiritless safe-blowers. Ezra stopped, and at his direction a dozen hands came forth to seize the culprits. He handed the bag of money to Nesbit. As he did so, there came another sputtering of cylinders, and a third automobile flashed upon the scene. Out of this leaped two men who wore black mustaches and derby hats. They took one look at the prisoners, and a score of eager mouths hastened to tell the story of the robbery. But the capture still mystified them. Old Ezra waited patiently until the detectives asked him for his evidence. "Well," said he, "I was afraid that fine car wasn't here for no good, so I just extracted the gasoline and the oil out of it. I figured I'd catch 'em if it got necessary. I left 'em enough gas for 10 miles. That's where I caught 'em." Mr. Nesbit plucked old Ezra by the sleeve and led him apart. "If I was a mite hasty the other day," said he, "I hope you'll forget it, Ezra. Your salary will get a considerable increase, and your office is yours as long as you want it." End of Youth will be Swerved by Robert M. Lee.